One of the biggest questions we all face is how are we supposed to live together when we believe in fundamentally different things? It's a huge question for our time. But what if a key to that answer could be found in a single chapter of a 1400-year-old text? Well, today, we're going to dive into the Quran's Surah Al-Ma'idah and explore a fascinating and really vital debate about diversity that's happening right now. Okay, so let's set the scene a little bit. Al Maidah, which literally means the table spread, was revealed in a city called Medina, and this detail is absolutely crucial. See, the Medinian chapters aren't just about abstract beliefs, they're practical guides for building a real, functioning society. They're about law, community, social rules, the whole shebang. So this chapter was, in a way, a blueprint for a diverse community. And that's exactly why it's still at the center of such an intense debate today. And that really brings us to the core puzzle, right? How can one single chapter be used to argue for both radical, open inclusivity and, at the same time, for guarding very strict religious boundaries? We're going to unpack this whole thing, and believe me, it gets right to the heart of what it means to have faith in our deeply interconnected, globalized world.
But hang on, before we jump headfirst into the debate, it probably helps to know what we're actually working with. So what exactly is inside this chapter?
So the chapter gets its name from the story about a heavenly feast, a table spread with food that was sent down to Jesus and his disciples. But honestly, the chapter itself is a feast of ideas. It's got 120 verses that cover a huge range of topics that were critical to that early Muslim community. Everything from law and ethics to the history of prophets who came before. I mean, just look at the range here. Al-Ma'idah gets into the real nitty-gritty of daily life, like dietary laws, but it also tackles these massive ethical questions, like what is justice and what are the rules of war? It's got the story of Cain and Abel, and one of the most famous verses in the entire Quran about the completion of the faith. It's this richness, this complexity, that makes it so central to Islamic thought. Okay, now we're getting to the heart of it, because tucked away in this chapter is one specific verse, verse 548, and it completely changes the entire conversation. It takes the idea of religious diversity from being, just an accident of history, and it turns it into something much, much more profound. This right here, this is the game changer. This verse suggests that God intentionally gave different laws to different communities. And you might ask, why? Well, the purpose was to test them, to encourage a kind of virtuous competition to see who is best in their good deeds. For a lot of modern scholars, this single idea is the foundation for an argument that diversity isn't a problem we need to solve, but a divine plan that we should embrace.
So let's follow that thread, shall we? How have some of the most influential modern Muslim thinkers taken this idea of a divine plan for diversity and built this powerful case for religious pluralism?
This leads to a really profound concept. The basic idea is that salvation, the ultimate goal of faith, isn't exclusive to just one particular group. Instead, what matters most is the quality of a person's faith and their actions, no matter what their religious label is. The fancy theological term for this is soteriological inclusivism. The late Indonesian scholar Nur Cholish Majid put this so beautifully. He argued for a kind of intellectual humility. His point was, since only God possesses absolute truth, all of our human interpretations are, by definition, relative. And this just completely flips the script. Suddenly, religious difference is no longer a source of conflict, but a blessing, a rahmat, that actually enriches all of us. And listen, this isn't just some philosophical idea they came up with. Proponents argue it's rooted firmly in the Quran itself. Majid and others built a really strong case from the text, pointing to multiple verses. You've got Al-Ma'idah 548, which we just saw, but also verses that talk about salvation for righteous Jews and Christians, and others that explicitly say there can be no compulsion in religion. But, as you can imagine, that is only one side of the story. On the other side of this debate, not all scholars are comfortable with such an inclusive approach. For them, the absolute priority is to protect the essential doctrines of Islam from being watered down. For these thinkers, the core concern is the potential danger to the Islamic creed, what's known as the Aqidah. They worry that if you start saying all religions are equally valid paths to God, it could lead to relativism, and that, they argue, erodes core beliefs like the absolute oneness of God, or tawhid. Some also see this kind of pluralism as a foreign idea, maybe something imported from Western liberal thought, rather than being authentically Islamic. And this highlights a really critical distinction they make. It's so important to get this. These scholars are not arguing against tolerance, not at all. They fully support social respect and peaceful coexistence, living peacefully with your neighbors of different faiths. What they reject is theological pluralism, the idea that all religious doctrines are equally true. For them, that's a red line that could lead to a blurring of faiths, which would compromise the core principles of Islam. And of course, their argument also comes from the text. Scholars like Anas Malik Toha, for example, point to verses where the Quran itself seems to make very clear distinctions. It draws a sharp line, they argue, between the believer, who is called the best of creation, and the disbeliever, who is called the worst of creation. So from their perspective, blurring this line for the sake of pluralism means you're ignoring the direct message of the sacred text. So we've got two powerful arguments, both based on the same text, that seem to be in total opposition. But what if it's not a simple binary? What if the reality is way more complex? The truth is, Islamic thought has always been a living, breathing dialogue. Instead of thinking about two opposing camps, it's probably more accurate to imagine a whole spectrum of positions that have evolved over centuries. And to help us get our heads around this, the scholar Muhammad Ali provides a fantastic framework that really breaks it all down. This framework is so helpful for seeing the nuance. So Ali identifies four main positions. First, you've got the exclusive view that Islam is the one and only path to salvation. Simple enough. Then there's the inclusive view that we've been talking about, where salvation is open to all people of good faith and good deeds. Then you have the pluralist view, which you often find in more mystical traditions like Sufism, that sees a single, universal truth that all religions are trying to reach in their own way. And finally, there's a more modern descriptive approach, which basically sets aside the whole question of salvation and just focuses on understanding other faiths objectively to foster dialogue and tolerance. So what's the big picture here? Well, the main thing to remember is that interpreting a sacred text like the Quran isn't a static, one-time thing. It's a dynamic, living process. And diversity isn't some side issue in Islam. It's a central theological question the faith has always grappled with. This ongoing debate, it's not a sign of division. It's a sign of incredible intellectual vitality as the global faith figures out how to navigate these timeless questions in our very modern world. And all of this brings us to one final question. In a world that's increasingly defined by its differences, this 1,400-year-old debate over the meaning of the table spread feels more relevant than ever before. The challenge, really, for all of us is to decide how this ancient wisdom can and should guide our shared and very diverse